So something about narcissists is that they experience something called narcissistic rage. And it's not like when you or I are like really frustrated and we're running late for our appointment and we're trying to get out the door and then our sweater gets caught on the handle and tears. And then we're like, what the fuck? And just get really frustrated. It's not like that. So when I was growing up, I would see it, these just outbursts seemingly out of nowhere. And I always wanted to like, I just imagined myself leaning in with a microphone, like, now can we, like an interview, like, can we just ask you a few questions about what was just going on there? And it wasn't until I started studying narcissism, I came across this. I was like, oh my gosh, that's what it is. So it's a moment that they're experiencing such deep shame, or where they're creating a story in their mind. So it's really based off of a delusion, a story that someone has slighted them or didn't worship them appropriately or whatever. And so it's just like this burst. In my family, I've seen it where you're just standing next to the person and they're like, oh, like out of nowhere. And you're like, what the hell just happened? And so I now just laugh imagining if you interviewed the person, and which brings me to something else that I imagine that makes me laugh so freaking hard. So as we've touched on before, we know that the narcissist is fully aware that everything they're doing is extremely toxic, but they are able to take themselves into a delusion where they're able to look away and just avoid acknowledging what they're doing so it doesn't bring them even more shame. So imagine with me, if you will, I just like die over this. So imagine the person that abused you and you called them out. And of course they denied your reality because they're too ashamed of it. But they do stand behind, of course, they do stand behind you calling them out. Because if it was someone who is not you, like if it was one of their slaves or their minions, like their other friend, like a friend of theirs that upholds all the hate, or looks away and makes sure, doesn't ever speak about it, if they had spoken up to someone, then the narcissist would be like, good for you. Thank God, you deserve to be heard. So we do know that they fully support you speaking up against them on some level, but in reality, they can't do that because then they'd have to acknowledge reality, and that's too much for them. So for me, it was that I spoke up about years of mistreatment, and that was like the big betrayal. So I imagine, how you'll see those videos of like a couple walking out of a movie theater or something, and they'll be interviewed suddenly like, hey, do you mind if we ask you guys a couple questions? Like, how long have you guys been together? And so I imagine it's kind of like that, like one of the head narcissists in my family, I imagine, like, who denied my reality when I called them out. I imagine someone interviewing them like, oh, could we just ask you a couple questions? Maybe they're coming out of the grocery store or something. And then the person's like, so do you think that kids, when they're mistreated, do you think that they should be speaking up about it? And of course they're going to say, of course, yes, they should be speaking up. And then I imagine they're like, all right, Taylor, come on out. And then I come out of the bush and I'm like, thank you. I knew you supported it. And they're just like, I sometimes will just be rolling on my bed laughing, imagining this, because they would be so horrified, disgusted, angry. That is you betraying them. Maybe for you called out a narcissist for like stealing your money and they were like, that's crazy. And so then imagine the interviewer like, sir, do you mind if we just ask you really quick a couple questions? Do you think that if somebody steals your money, do you think it's appropriate for you to report them and receive an apology for that? They'd be like, absolutely. Come on out, Stephen. And then they would totally just, how dare you? I don't believe this. And then that's how they like get away with it instead of having to acknowledge it. They just pretend that you're insane. That would be probably the funniest moment of my life, to watch them with like a video camera on them acknowledge that they totally stand behind me calling out toxicity. Like, of course they stand behind it. They just don't want to have to acknowledge it because then they'll feel even worse about themselves. And there's not room for that, So, oh my God, but how funny would that be?